In addition to that, businesses also have to pay a property tax on the equipment that they use in their business. And there's a mechanism in the current law that businesses do not have to pay this tax on the first $68,000 of equipment that they use in their business. Now, $68,000 is a number that has kind of grown over time. It was originally set at $50,000, but it had a little adjustment factor in there so that as inflation went up, that went up with it. So that 50,000 number has now grown to $68,000. This would change, so that's kind of an exemption. You're exempt, if you're a company, if you're a business, you're exempt from paying this property tax on equipment. You still have to pay property tax on your land and buildings, but you're exempt from having to pay this property tax on your equipment for the first $68,000 of equipment that you use in your business. Proposition 116 would increase that exemption level quite substantially to somewhere around the neighborhood of about $2.4 million. And the purpose for this was that those that supported this in the legislature are doing this to try to make Arizona more business friendly by relieving many businesses. The medium and big size will, if you're Intel and you have billions of dollars worth of equipment, whether it's at $68,000 or $2 million, it's probably not that big of a difference. But if you're a small or medium-sized business, it's a big difference. And those that have supported this are trying to make Arizona more business friendly by increasing the exemption. This tax does not bring in a large portion of the tax monies that are collected in the state of Arizona through the property tax. It's less than 1% of the total amount of taxes that are collected through the property tax system. So it's not a significant change in the dollar amount that will be collected, but it just would increase the exemption level from that $68,000 to $2.4 million. But it doesn't use the phrase 2.4 million. It uses another index that the supporters of this idea came up with that would kind of float with the economy and grow over time, like the 50,000 has grown over time into 68 by going up with inflation. The number that they picked here, or the index that they picked, was 50, the salary of 50 average Arizona workers. And the average Arizona worker apparently makes about $48,000, because if you multiply 50 times $48,000, that's how you get this $2.4 million number. And if and as salaries go up in the future in the state, that would grow with that. But initially it's estimated that the new number, and the legislature will have to pass a law deciding which specific data point or index it's going to use for the average salary of the average Arizona worker. But right now it's in the $46,000 or $48,000 range, I think. And so those that have looked at this have estimated that the new exemption, instead of being $68,000, will be $2.4 million. And again, it's to try to make Arizona more business friendly so that other companies that are thinking about locating to Arizona, or those that are already here, would be relieved to having to pay the taxes on all the little chairs and computers and desks and file cabinets and everything that they own and use in their business. Because you have to pay as long as you use the piece of equipment. You never really get to write it off like you do for depreciation and things like that. So that's 116, increases this exemption level quite substantially to give some relief to businesses. Yes, sir.
Isn't the argument on that is that when they bought that equipment, they paid the sales tax on it, and that should be the tax they pay?
Well, yeah, I think people who are against this tax in the first place would say, when I first bought the equipment, first of all, I paid income tax when I made the money that I then used to buy something. When I bought that something, I probably paid a sales tax. And to have to then pay a property tax on it forever, never, never, and never really get to depreciate it and quit paying property tax on it, is part of Arizona's tax system, one of the more negative maybe parts of our tax system in Arizona that might keep us from being as attractive as we might otherwise be to other companies that might locate here. And that would be one of their reasons, yes. Yes?
What did the original $68,000 ad, how did that number originate?
Excuse me. The original 68, well, the 68 originally came from a $50,000 number that was selected 10 or 15 years ago. Thank you, Joan, if you're going to give me one. So sometime, and I don't remember, I remember when I ran our family business, I remember that $50,000 exemption coming in, I think about late 80s or early 90s. So maybe for about 20 years or so, there was a $50,000 exemption. It used to be that from the very first dollar of any equipment that every business owned and used in their business, they had to pay a property tax on it. And years ago, they put in an exemption at $50,000, but they tied it to the inflation, CPI, so that it would grow over time. It has grown from 50 to 68. And there's some that have actually said, I think I saw the Arizona, one of the columnists in the Arizona Republic said, instead of doing this 50 times the average Arizona worker thing, they should have just eliminated it completely. But I assume that the people who wanted this weren't sure whether the people would vote to eliminate it completely, but they might vote to raise it pretty substantially from 68,000 to a couple million. Any other questions on 116? All right. 117 also has to do with property tax, but it has to do with the values of our property, both homes and businesses. And if you have owned a piece of property and received your tax valuation card that comes from the county assessor, you'll notice that in Arizona we use two different numbers. One's called full cash value and the other one's called limited cash value. And to make a long story short, the first thing that Proposition 117 would do, if passed, would be to use one number instead of two. And theoretically, I think it would go more to the full cash value, which is supposed to be the kind of the market value of your property. Currently, the full cash value is used for your primary property taxes, and the limited cash value is used for your secondary property taxes. And it's one of the elements of Arizona. Thank you, Joan. It's one of the elements of Arizona's property tax system that we are known for having quite a complicated system. And this is one of the elements, is that we have these two value numbers. Proposition 117 would require that only one number, one value is used for all values on which property taxes are based. The second thing that it would do is that it would limit the amount that the value of your property can increase from one year to another to 5%. And now if the assessor determined that your property increased from one year to another by 2 or 3 or something less than 5 or went down, all of that could happen. But the most that the value of your property could be increased from one year to another would be 5%. And those are the two things that this essentially does, is it consolidates or combines the two values into, we're only going to use one value, and it can only go up 5% from one year to the next. Some might say, well, that's maybe a little bit similar to the Prop 13 thing in California, where I think it can only go up 1% or something like that. The difference on this one is that this applies to the property irrespective of whether a new owner buys it. In California, you have a limit. It can only go up 1% a year, I think. But if a new buyer comes in and buys it at a much higher rate or value, their new value starts there. This one would actually say that it doesn't matter who buys whatever. The property, whatever the property was valued last year, it can only be valued no more than 5% more than that this year. So it's a 5% limit on the increase in the value, irrespective of who owns the property. Any questions on 117? This applies to real property, which is considered land and buildings, whether it's businesses or homes.
One question on
Yes.
that. That's part of a two-piece puzzle. One is the value of the property,
Correct.
but the other is the assessment that comes. Does it limit assessments in any way?
No, this only addresses, and that's a good point, that how much you pay in property tax is based on two factors. The value of the property and the rate that then is assigned as a property tax rate by a variety of different governmental entities that get to tax your property, whether it's a city council or a county board of supervisors or a school district or a community college district. There's a variety of different governmental entities that get to tax your property. And there are two factors. They look at the value and then they determine a rate. It's multiplied times that. This only applies to limiting how much your value can go up. You would still have to kind of keep your eye on the rates that the different governmental entities are applying on that value. Yes, Janet?
You were mentioning increasing value. Does it say anything about limitations on decreasing value?
No. Does not have a similar, can only go down by 5% from what it says. The most it can increase from one year to the next is 5%. Okay, that's 117. 118 has to do with what's called the permanent fund of the state land trust. When Arizona became a state, there were about 11 million acres of land that were set aside in what's called the state trust lands. And as that land is sold or leased, the money from the sale or lease of those lands goes into a trust fund. The trust fund monies are then invested. And as they earn interest or return on that investment, that money is paid out to the beneficiaries of the state trust lands. There's about 13 beneficiaries. The largest by far of which is the K-12 school system in the state of Arizona. But there are others, the state prison system, the universities and community colleges, the mental hospital, Pioneers Home up in Prescott, and maybe 6 or 8 others. But all of the beneficiaries receive a payment from the interest that is earned on the trust fund. The trust fund currently has about $3.5 billion in it. The current formula for determining how much to pay out to the beneficiaries each year is based on a little bit of a complicated formula that looks back about 5 years and says, what's the average rate of return that we were receiving on our investments over the last 5 years? When the state treasurer's office looked at that, they realized that because those investments go up and down some years, the payout over the next 8 or 9 years was going to be sometimes real high and sometimes not very much at all. In fact, they had a consulting company came in and predicted that there were actually going to be a few years in the next 8 or 9 years where the beneficiaries would receive 0. And they didn't think that was such a good idea, so they have proposed, and what Prop 118 does is instead of using the old formula of whatever you earned for the last 5 years, that's going to be the payout next year, it would set a rate of 2.5% would be paid out each year for the next 8 years. Then at the end of that, we'll have to reevaluate it, see if that's working better than the old system. The projections from the company that did this evaluation are that this new system, this new way of doing it, 2.5% each year instead of some up, some down, will pay out almost twice as much money during the next 8 or 9 years as the old system would have. Of course, that made all the beneficiaries happy who are going to receive those payments. And the land department and the people that run the state trust land believe that there's sufficient monies in the fund so that if you just pay out 2.5% instead of an up and down thing, that will be better than. So that's what's proposed in Proposition 118. 2.5% each of the next 8 years, I think it is, instead of this up and down thing where it might be high, might be low, might be zero.
How do you get on the list of beneficiaries?
How do you get on the list of beneficiaries by being here when the state was created? or amending the Constitution to have you or your family added to the list of beneficiaries. Any other questions about 118? Yes?
Do you have any numbers on maybe average rates that it has been paying off in the last?
I don't know the numbers of the average rates that it's been paying, but like I say, the concern was kind of this up and down thing, and they wanted to create a little more stable formula so that it paid out I guess a guaranteed amount that the beneficiaries could kind of count on instead of wondering whether next year's going to be way up or zero. Okay. 119 also has to do with the state trust lands. But basically, Proposition 119 would allow the state trust lands to not only be sold or leased, but they could also be exchanged for like federal lands. If those exchanges helps to protect our military facilities in Arizona or improve the general management of the state trust lands. It would still require that those exchanges have independent appraisals, and each exchange would still have to be voted on and approved by the voters. But the reason for adding exchanges to the ability to sell or lease the land is because when we first started out as a state, the federal laws and the state laws allowed these trust lands to be sold or leased. And like I said earlier, the money then went into a trust fund and that was invested and that paid out to beneficiaries. Years ago, or decades ago even, the federal government changed their laws so that in addition to being able to sell the land or lease the land, you could exchange the land. Because you might have a piece of property that doesn't do the state very much good here, but if I exchange it for a piece of federal land over there that they weren't using, they might be able to use this and we could use that and both would benefit as long as they were the same value and on and on and on. So the federal government changed their laws that allowed for the exchanges of lands, but the state has never amended our Constitution. So this Prop 119 would propose that these exchanges also be allowed as long as it is for protecting our military bases or for the general improvement of managing our state trust lands. This is an idea that's been tried several times over the last 10 or 20 years and usually was never constructed in a way that it got the support of most of the groups that are focused in on environmental things, and Sierra Club and the Land Trust, or there's a few other. It's kind of surprising to many that this year, however they put this together, quite a few of the groups that usually oppose this are now supporting this, which makes the people that supported this in the past worried of doing something wrong. Anyway, so it's a bit, I've heard people say, well, I see that the so-and-so supports this and the I don't like the so-and-sos, and so now I'm worried about it. So all of that will have to be worked out, and it's ultimately up to the voters whether they pass it or not. So you can read in the pamphlet who supports it and who doesn't, and you'll kind of see for the first time, kind of a unique group of people that are usually on opposite sides of the fence. Now, many of, if not most of them, are on the same side of supporting it. But
speaking of those pamphlets, have they gone out yet?
yes, these pamphlets have gone out. About 2 million were mailed, and they were supposed to be, one was supposed to be mailed to each household in which a registered voter resided. So if you haven't received yours, call the Secretary of State's office and we can get one to you. You can probably see most of the data on our website too at azsos.gov. Yes, ma'am.
I just had a question. So, yeah, this has been on the ballot multiple times. With the language, do you think it was confusing before? And how much of an effect do you have if the language does come in, it's kind of confusing? Can you throw it out, or does your office at all?
Our office, Secretary of State's office, has nothing to do with the management of the state trust lands.
Right.
And if it passes, then the ability to exchange trust lands instead of just sell or lease them, they'll have basically those three tools: selling, leasing, or exchanging it. Right now, they can only really sell or lease it. And some people often ask, well, what's an example of how this, when would the state maybe need or want to exchange some land instead of just sell it? If there was a piece of state trust land near one of our Air Force bases, Luke or Davis Monthan or something, if the state had a piece of trust land near a base, they might be reluctant to sell it, because then if someone bought it and developed something on there, the first thing they'll do next morning is complain about the planes flying overhead. But if the federal government had a piece of property somewhere else in the state and could exchange that land with the state trust lands, then the federal government might be able to build something on that land that would not conflict with the military bases. The state would then own a piece of property elsewhere that it could sell or lease to anyone else without having a conflict. So it's those kinds of things that they're trying to facilitate. And I don't think I answered your question very well, because my office doesn't, Secretary of State's office doesn't have anything to do with.
I'm just saying it's kind of the same idea that's been presented over and over again. And is it just more, as far as what language the group decides the legislature it seems to propose?
I participated a few years ago in some of the negotiations when I was at the legislature to try to work out some language that all sides could agree on, and for whatever reason, they didn't find that language then. They have apparently now, for whatever reason. Now, and I'm not implying that everyone's in support of this, but several of the groups that used to oppose this pretty regularly now brought in arguments saying that they support this now.